Welcome back to the Podcast Interview Marketing Show. I am Tom Schwab, and today's episode, well, it might step on some toes, but only because we're stepping into the truth. It's going to make your interview stronger and your results better. Now, we've all heard that just tell your story. And too often, that's the start of a podcast interview that goes absolutely nowhere. Our guest today, Kristen Nolan, is one of our senior client account managers. And she joins me to call out the biggest mistake we've seen podcast guests make, leading with a tired, irrelevant, redundant origin story. We break down why your resume isn't your hook, how to shift from ego to empathy, and why your expertise, not your autobiography, is what turns those listeners into leads. This isn't about ditching your story altogether. It's about using it strategically to support your insights and show real value. If you've ever wondered why your interviews aren't getting traction or how to stand out without sounding like everyone else, this conversation will challenge the way you show up and the way you serve. Let's get into it. Today, you get to listen into Kristen Nolan, one of our senior client account managers, and I talk about something that I have been doing rants on lately. And it's for the love of God, please stop telling your origin story. Kristen, let's unpack this a little bit. You want to explain what the origin story is that people tell on podcasts?
Yeah. So it usually starts with the host and they'll say, tell us about yourself. Right. And I always tell my clients, this is not the time to start reciting your resume. No one cares what you did in middle school. No one cares what you did in high school. It's not the time to rattle off your resume. It's a time to connect. And I think that's really where the power lies in being a good guest.
Yeah. And I don't know who started this, but there's a lot of speakers training out there that teaches this, that this is what your keynote's supposed to be. I was broken just like you. Then I figured this out. And now I'm someone you look up to and I can help you get here too. And I think it's pathetic because it's a pathetic story, right? It doesn't build up your expertise. There's a point where you connect with people, but I always say when you show up on a podcast interview, people are just asking, who are you? Why are you here? And why can you help me? Right? And I'll admit, I made this mistake early on, right? I've been doing podcast interviews for probably 15 years. And I cringe when I hear some of the old ones. It's like, I was born here. I went to this school. This is where I live. This is my pets' names. That's not even interesting on a biography story, right? What's the overarching theme? And like you said, too many people just show up and it's like, here's my life story.
Yeah. And I think that people then want to tune you out. So if you're not finding a way to connect with people, if you're not finding a way to bring value to the conversation, they're going to turn you off versus turn you up. And I think that's really something that people kind of do, almost as a, not an intentional, but like self-sabotage, right? If you're not connecting with that initial, first piece, how do you connect throughout the rest of the interview? Because you're making it all about yourself.
Exactly. It makes it about yourself and you don't have a point of view. You've just, you had said earlier in a conversation that it's like, this is my little world, right? And everybody else is just supporting characters. I'm just here to tell you about me, enough about me. What do you think about me? It's just tiring. And when people do numerous interviews, thinking that if I just tell my story, people will come to me. Well, no, you've told your story over and over. You've never told your expertise or your point of view. It's like, what's your hook?
Yeah. And I think the other part to this is like, people want to hear and be able to connect to a problem, and then you have to present them with a solution, right? So if you're consistently talking about just yourself, you're not able to have the listeners or the host visualize themselves in, a specific issue or a problem, and then how you and your expertise can solve that problem. So shifting the focus there, I think, can really be beneficial in how you present yourself.
Yeah. One of the Tomisms that I always say is we're all selling preparation H, right? People don't care about your story. They care about the pain in their rear end. They want relief. They want somebody that's trusted, and just telling your story doesn't do that. You're not bringing any value to the podcast, or you're not bringing any value to the audience.
Absolutely. And and there are certain podcasts that, their specific target is, they want you to share your story. They want to, things like that. That's great. Share your story on those podcasts. But if that's not the case, hosts aren't booking you for your story. They're booking you for your perspective and your expertise. So, you have to have more than just who you are and where you came from. And like you said, you need to present a problem and a solution.
I think if you think of the best speakers, the best experts out there, you may know their backstory, but they don't tell their backstory every time, right? It would be really silly. If they had to tell their backstory every time. It's almost like they're saying, well, I'm not an expert. You don't see me as an expert, but here, let me tell you why I am. It's like, no, you just show up, and that you're there as an invited guest of the host already gives you that credibility. You don't have to redo that credibility every time. And like you said, there's a place for the backstory, right? What's it? MTV has, behind the music. Okay. Some of those are interesting. There are podcasts that focus just on the backstory, right? There's other ones that focus on the sale of your company, whatever it is. But this idea that so many people are having to just go on all these podcasts and tell the stories, it's not working. And I think people are doing themselves a great disservice on that. It's almost like that curse.
One of the perspectives that a client recently shared with me is he's like, hey, I'm podcast guesting for my company. I'm not here for my ego. And so I think when you're able to really distinguish like what it is your purpose that you want as a podcast guest, right? So he's going on podcasts to, talk about his company and talk about, all the things that he and his, employees have done. He's not there to talk about himself. And so having that mindset then flips to where it's more about like education, right? Here is what I'm going to teach you. Here is what I'm going to show you. Here is a problem that I'm going to solve. And so then you're really able to connect with people because they are able to see themselves in what you're talking about.
Yeah. And that idea of, even if somebody isn't there to talk about themselves, right? I always say you're not doing podcast interview marketing for ego, right? You might be doing podcast guesting for ego, but don't confuse that with marketing. Is that idea of the I believe statements that are so powerful, right? That point of view, right? Of, I believe that you're one conversation away, not one funnel away. And I believe that because then you start to go into your story of what that is, but it's supporting to that belief, right? If I just tell the story, people are like, so what? Why? How does this apply to me? And, I think you hit it on the nail on the head when people are going on there for ego just to tell their story. And I think it turns off clients, it turns off hosts, and I guess the AI that's listening too. It's like once they know your origin story, you don't have to keep telling it.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned AI. I actually was working on some questions for a client. We had a podcast that has some like pre-screening questions before they'll consider a guest. And it actually brought up a story that I hadn't heard before. So I brought it up to the client and he like chuckled and he's like, I say this all the time in our meetings. And he was like, where did you get this? And I was like, well, AI pulled it. So I gave him kudos because I was like, clearly this is becoming part of your, like what I would call an AI profile. And he was like, yeah, that's a great story. And so, I think there's so much value in AI and how that's, being part of our story as well.
Yeah. And it's the idea of, content is king, but context is God, right? Small G, right? So you tell you different parts of your stories, in different ways, right? When they support the story, the hook is not your story. The hook is your point of view, the value that you're bringing, the differentiation, and you support that with your story. So like you said, in some podcasts, you could talk about, what you learned as a parent. Other ones, you could learn what you learned during this travel or previous companies. And I love how some of our clients have even worked it in to make it I don't want to say a humble brag, but to tell people what they do. Tim Sanders, great author, great keynote speaker. When he was telling his story, he would always work into it that, I was speaking at this event. So if somebody asked him a question, he would say, that's a very interesting one. I was speaking at a keynote the other day with this, and this came up, and this is how we unpacked it there. So he just told you that he's a keynote speaker that's flying around the country, right? He didn't have to say that in his life story, right? I'm a keynote speaker. I've spoken on 8 of the 7 continents. I'm Delta, double diamond, all the rest of this. It's not important. But if you're can work that into an answer to somebody, that's more powerful. Or even, I'm a high level executive coach, right? You don't have to say that. Work it into an answer, right? When somebody says, something about your book, right? And you're unpacking that. I just worked with somebody the other day, high level executive. If I mentioned the company, you would know it, but I'd never do that for confidentiality. And the problem this senior executive was working on is exactly what we're talking, and then start to go into that. Boom. You just told some of your story there, and you told me you're an executive coach with high level people here. And it flowed much better than just reading my LinkedIn profile.
Yeah. And it sounds so different, right? It doesn't sound as if you're bragging. It's just very organically weaved into the conversation, which I think is so important. And I think another piece of this is being relevant, right? So making sure that your message is relevant to your audience. So I will often tell clients, don't go and have the same conversation on every single podcast. Make sure that your stories, make sure that your, things that you're talking about are relevant to the audience. Are you finding a way to connect with them so that they can visually see themselves in your problem and your solution? If you're going on a podcast to talk about construction, have a story about a construction company that you worked with. And then that way you're able to make it less about you and more about the particular client that you're talking about or the particular company that you're sharing about. And so then it can be more impactful to the listeners so that you're able to connect with them in that way.
Yeah. And even that relevance of age or the relevance of geography, right? So if I'm on a podcast and it's an older audience, I might reference different things, right? The other day I was talking and did a analogy of why SEO today is like the Yellow Pages was in Y2K, right? I was talking with someone that was my age, right? I imagined that his audience was a little bit older. In fact, I looked at the demographics that we licensed, and it looked like an older audience. If I was on a podcast with a younger host that probably would have had a younger audience, I wouldn't have used that example because they would have said, what's the Yellow Pages, right? It would have had no relevancy to them. Or even sometimes in speaking with people from other countries, right? You have to make sure that the examples that you use and the stories that you tell are meaningful to them, right? English, it's a great language, but both the Brits and us don't speak that same language. So think about that before you use an analogy and say, yeah, I played football in college and all the rest of this. That means a totally different thing. Or referencing something that is big in the United States, but could be meaningless over there because all of a sudden you make it sounds like your story doesn't relate to them.
Yeah, and I think one thing that you really hit on that I think is so crucial is doing the research beforehand, right? Like if you as a guest are expecting to just sort of wing it and show up, that's not going to work out very well for you. Whereas if you're doing the research to really know who the audience is, and even with AI, you can go in and you can say what is the audience of XYZ podcast, right? And then it'll, that way you're going in so that you're able to do the research and have, a better sense of who you're going to be speaking to or who's going to be listening to the podcast so that you can cater your message to those people versus just kind of showing up and saying, okay, well, here it is. It's about me. I'm going to share my story. I'm going to share my thoughts, and really make it to where it's about the host and the audience.
Yeah. And you guys do such a great job prepping me for my interviews, right? Just going to the dashboard and saying, this is the background on the host, because looking at that, if the host is interested in something, the audience probably is too, or at least they've brought it up before, right? Was recently on a call and the podcast host lives in Annapolis, right? I wouldn't have known that until I saw the brief sheet and it's like the LinkedIn profile went there and it's like, oh, Annapolis. So we could talk a little bit beforehand, about that and the connection that I had to that. So during the interview, he brings it up that, Tom's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, right? And so he brought it up. I didn't have to bring that up, but we instantly had some kind of little connection from doing a little bit of research beforehand, as opposed to some people, I think, just look at it as they show up and it's like, hello, podcast host. Can I just give my keynote now?
Yeah. And I think, one other thing that kind of we do internally for clients is we do a podcast analysis, right? So with our clients, we will then, after their first couple of interviews, sort of give feedback, right? What works, what doesn't work. One of the things that I find to be really interesting, and I always tell my clients, is that we want a podcast episode to be a conversation. As you mentioned, a keynote, we want it to be more of a conversation, right? So it should be about 50-50 where you're speaking 50-ish and the host is maybe it's 60-40 or 70-30 along those lines. But I think there is so much value to having a conversation. And I often say this, I believe that the best podcasts that I prefer to listen to, and I probably sound a little creepy saying this, are like feeling like you're in a coffee shop and you're just sort of eavesdropping on two people next to you, having a conversation of value next to you. And I think those are the ones that I personally like listening to and I find the most value in.
Yeah. And we want to eavesdrop on it because it's interesting, right? And sometimes it's a coffee shop. Sometimes it's a bar at closing, depending what the conversation is. But it's that same way. If somebody was just, practicing their keynote behind you, you probably wouldn't listen as much. Or if somebody was doing an interview for the new busboy and asking all the people the same questions, that's annoying, not interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the other piece of this is like, if you're going on a podcast and you're talking about yourself and you're making it all about you, why would people want to visit your website? Why would people want to come and learn more about you? Like they already know everything about you, right? Like you haven't given them a problem. You haven't given them a solution. You haven't given them a reason why they should reach out to you. So essentially, if you're taking this approach, you're not really going to gain anything from it because people are going to turn you off versus turn you up and want to learn more.
I was smiling thinking, and now I'm dating myself when people used to come back from vacation and they'd have their pictures from vacation and they just wanted to tell you all about their story. People would avoid them like the plague, right? It's not interesting to me. It's your story. Tell me what you learned, what you got out of it, how I can apply it. That's interesting. But I'm not here for a presentation. I'm here to listen to a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if we really look at it and approach it from the angle of like, I'm coming on a podcast to help people, I'm coming on a podcast to help teach them about something that I offer, whether it's a product or a service. If we come from a place of service, I feel like things just sort of naturally occur versus coming on a podcast and saying, this is my opportunity to really highlight all the great things about myself. And I'm going to, it's almost like a used car salesman, approach to podcasting, I would say.
Yeah. One of our clients, I learned so much from them, looked at it as the difference between influencers and experts, right? Influencers are all about the attention. Look at me. Here's my story. This is what I have. This is what I have done, right? The experts are confident in themselves. They don't have to do that. They can just come and bring value. So I think when people rely too much on their story, it's almost a tell that they're not comfortable in their expertise, right? If you're invited on the podcast, assume that the host has vetted you and you're an expert. Now bring value.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a client now and there are some, jitters, right? Like she's a little more nervous to be a podcast guest. So like she prefers, doing a pre-call. Not every host offers that. And so really how I've been working with her to kind of strategize around that is, again, we're leaning into AI. Is there a trend in the type of questions? Is there certain things that I can help provide her with that she knows kind of what to expect, but not from a place of where things feel rehearsed? Because I think sometimes, people will come and they'll have, their window open and they'll have their Word document open and, they're almost reading a script, right? And so it's like, they're having the same conversation, 15 times. They're reading a script and there's just no value there. And it's boring.
And that was the standard a decade ago, was show up on as many podcasts, tell the same story. And I think it came off the radio, right? Because when somebody would launch a book on radio, Tony Robbins was the master of this, right? The guy's an animal. He'd be on from 5 a.m. East Coast time to 10 a.m. West Coast time every 5 minutes doing a different call-in radio show talking about his new book. Every conversation was the same, right? And it was effective because nobody ever heard the same interviews. Well, now today, people are listening to multiple interviews. They're all recorded and AI is looking at all of them. And it sounds silly when you think about it. If you write a blog, where I write a weekly blog and every blog is the same, right? People would laugh at you, right? They would say, it's search engine would say that's duplicate content, but so many people are just doing duplicate content podcast interviews, right? They've got one keynote that they've practiced and that's what they do.
Yeah, it's like this. I feel like, and I say this sometimes, I feel like we have become kind of a box checking culture where we're like, okay, I've got to check this box, right? Okay, marketing check, podcast check. And I think what happens is we lose that personal element of it. And we have to take a step back and shift our mindset to, not only am I doing this podcast interview, but am I doing it to the best of my ability? Am I maximizing the time that I have, with the host? Am I maximizing the time that I have in front of the microphone to make sure that I'm using that to the best of my ability, right? Like I would never get up and do a keynote speech and not have the preparation and not take full advantage of the time that I have to make it the best that I can. And so I think that we also have to remember that, if we're doing something on the radio or we're doing a TED Talk or we're doing a keynote speech or we're doing a podcast, they're all different mediums. And so we have to prepare accordingly. We can't have a one size fits all approach.
Well, I think we spent a lot of time talking about why you should not just tell your story on every podcast, right? So, what are some positive things that we can do to tell people and share with them that we've seen really work, where you can weave your story in without it being the entire podcast interview?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you mentioned, sort of just weaving in that expertise and kind of organically. And I think also using stories, right? Stories that, resonate. And it can be stories about experiences and things, but you don't do that off the bat, right? You weave those in very organically into the conversation so that it feels very natural within the conversation. And so you're able to do that to further that connection and really highlight, your expertise and things like that throughout the interview.
Yeah. And we've done a podcast interview with Jeff Barch about storytelling. And that was one. And then Adrian McIntyre talked about the art of the anecdote. And I learned so much from those, where it's the idea of a story's got to have a point, right? It's got to have the setup, the conflict, and then what you learned from it, right? If it's just a story about a moment in time, it's like, what's the point of the story? Why did you even tell that? The same thing about anecdotes, right? You've got to tell it and then tell people what it means. I didn't really appreciate that until those two guests really showed it. You look at of any Aesop's fables, any of those great, ones that we learned at the very beginning growing up. At the end of it, they would always say, and this is what it means, right? When the Greek god, or I'm going to mess this up now, flew too close to the sun and his wings of wax melted, and then the story was like, don't fly too high, and they forgot to tell that it was also don't fly too low, because he also got them corroded in the ocean there. So tell people a story, make it applicable, and then tell them what it means to them.
Yeah. And I think, how can they implement that, right? How can they take the podcast they've just listened to and implement whatever it is that you've talked about, right? What can they take away from that to implement today to see the changes that you've mentioned? And so I think really giving, an insight, a story, and an action can be really valuable, to then give them something to actually take away.
I'm scared to death that you guys are going to take my podcast interviews from a dozen years ago and run them through our analysis tool now, because I can remember being so proud to say, yes, I live in rural Southwest Michigan. I don't have any neighbors. I've got 2 miniature donkeys here. And it went on and on. It's like, who cares? Right? There was no point to it. Now I can say something like, listen, you can do podcast interviews from anywhere, right? Here I am in rural Southwest Michigan. I can't even see one of my neighbors, but if I look, I can see 2 miniature donkeys, right? If I can do podcast interviews from here, you can do them from wherever you are. That is a story that is memorable and has a meaning. It's about value and what it brings for them, not just more about me. So as we say in here, the podcast interview marketing show is where we share our insights, our ideas, so that you can learn from them. Right. In the Navy, we used to say, learning from your own mistakes is painful and stupid. Learn from other people's.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love your story because I think, there is that emotional connection. Who doesn't love donkeys? So when you bring up things that people love, donkeys, puppies, and kids, it's an immediate connection for, people listening too.
Kristen, thank you so much for sharing your insights on this. I know you work with lots of great high-level clients there. You get to see what's working with them. And together, we all learn better on this and share it with the world.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom.
Wow. What a powerful reminder from Kristen Nolan on how to show up like an expert, not just a guest on every podcast. We talked about why leading with your life story is often a disservice to your marketing and to your audience. Instead, show up with a perspective, a point of view, and a problem you're here to solve. Support it with relevant stories. Make your expertise relatable. Give listeners a reason to see themselves in the challenge and in your solution. So here's the actionable takeaway. Before your next interview, ask yourself, what does this audience need to hear? And how can I show up to help them? Do your research. Tailor your message. Don't repeat the same worn out script, especially when it's your origin story. Because podcast interviews, they're not about attention. They're about trust. The hosts are bringing you on for your perspective. The listeners are tuning in for value. Let's give them both and make every interview count. Until next time, remember, it's not about telling your story. It's about making your story serve the listeners, your future clients.